Hey, welcome back. I'm glad you decided to continue on in our study of the Gospel of John. We're going to close out chapter 1 today. You know, when I was a young man, a little boy, I used to walk just about everywhere I went for the longest time. And even after I had a bicycle, I did a lot of walking. Um, when I was a boy, my daddy used to say when I was a boy. And um, that's kind of always been a chuckle for me because it was always the story of walking uphill through a blinding snowstorm to school and walking uphill home on the same day from school to home. So he walked uphill both ways. Never did quite figure that out. I think he was pulling my leg. But nonetheless, um, walking was a way of life in ancient Israel. They had a conveyance of a donkey. It wasn't a very comfortable ride, but there were times when they would ride donkeys. But most of the time they would walk wherever they went. And we see that in this narrative from verse 35 all the way through the end of the chapter in verse 51, where Jesus and these young men are walking with him. And they're walking sometimes 15 miles, 19 miles, 20 miles, 35 miles, so on and so forth. And sometimes it's a day's journey, and sometimes it's a couple of days. So we need to bear this in mind that it's just not a split second when all these things happen. There was time invested here. So get your Bibles out. Let's open it up to the Gospel of John, chapter 1. And we're going to start in verse 43 and read to 51, the ending of the chapter. And then we're going to go back and we're going to do a quick summary of verses 35 through 42 to build upon those with the rest of this scripture. Okay, are you with me? Here we go. The following day, Jesus wanted to go to Galilee, and he found Philip and said to him, "Follow me." A little bit different from come and see, right? Now, Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. And Philip found Nathanael and said to him, "We have found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." And Nathanael said to him, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" Well, Nazareth was a city of scorn and kind of disrepute. So that's the basis for his statement. We're going to get into that a little bit deeper. Philip said to him, "Come and see." And Jesus saw Nathanael coming toward him and said of him, "Behold an Israelite indeed, in whom is no deceit." Jesus is proclaiming that this young man is pure in heart, that he's not deceitful, he's not full of guile. The world hasn't sullied him. He's a righteous man. And Nathanael answered and said to him, "How do you know me?" And Jesus answered him and said, "Before Philip called you, when you were under the fig tree, I saw you." And Nathanael answered him and said to him, "Rabbi, you're the Son of God. You're the King of Israel." And Jesus answered to him, and I can see Jesus smiling. "Because I said to you, I saw you under the fig tree, do you believe? You will see greater things than these." And he said to him, "Most assuredly, I say to you, hereafter you shall see the heavens open and the angels of God ascending and descending upon the Son of Man." Now he's making a reference right there to Genesis chapter 28, verse 12, where it talks about Jacob's ladder. And that same language is used. Jacob had a dream and he saw angels ascending and descending from heaven down to earth. And we don't see those spiritual realms, but God tells us that he has angels all about us. Now, we're not talking about angel worship. We're talking about ministering angels who come to help man through life, especially those who believe in God. So, in verses 35 through 42, where this whole narrative really begins, we see Jesus was at the Jordan, and he was actually in Jordan at Bethabara on the opposite shore, apart from Israel, on the other side, away from Israel. And he left, and Andrew and John followed him when they said, "We want to see where you live." And he said, "Come and see." Well, we're not told where he was staying, where he lived, but we know that Andrew and John spent the rest of that day with him, probably through the evening and the next. We're not sure completely because the Bible's silent on that. So we can only draw reasonable conclusions without stretching the scriptures or misinterpreting them. And then by implication, the next day, Peter was proselytized or witnessed to by his brother Andrew, and Andrew brought him to Jesus, and Peter spent time with him. And Peter said, "Yeah, I think you're right." And he believed. Now, it's a very good possibility that Peter was at the Jordan with his brother Andrew and with John, and they were disciples of John the Baptist. We're not sure, but most scholars believe that. In verse 43, catching us up, Jesus wanted to go to Galilee. Now, from the Jordan, if that was the case, it's about 40 miles. Or from Nazareth, it's about 35 miles to Bethsaida, which is near Capernaum. Now, this is probably a 2-day journey, and these folks walked everywhere. This was part of their life. And I imagine they wore out several pairs of sandals in their lifetime. But we need to understand that the receiving and believing for all of these young men, these 5 men, took place differently at different times in a short period of time. Andrew, and it's assumed John, believed after spending the day with Jesus and perhaps the next, came to faith in Jesus. He becomes real to them based upon their heritage and their knowledge of the scriptures and the whole Jewish lifestyle. Peter's proselytized or witnessed to, and he in turn comes to faith in Jesus. So the first 2 followed and became intimately acquainted, and then Peter's introduced, and the 3 of them believe. And then Jesus walks to Galilee, probably with Andrew and Peter and John. And we're told that Philip is from Bethsaida, the same city that Andrew, or the same town that Andrew and Peter are from, so they probably knew one another. And Jesus calls him, and Philip believes. But he isn't the one that initiates the contact this time. It's Jesus. And Philip comes to faith. And then Philip, like Andrew, goes to his friend Nathanael. And Nathanael's also known as Bartholomew in the scriptures. And he says, "Dude, you need to come see this man. We believe he's the Messiah." And Nathanael, of course, at the first invitation goes, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" Well, you have to understand that Nazareth was an insignificant city, and it was a place of scorn and disdain by the Jews. And the Galilean area also was disdained by those in Judea, down where Jerusalem was. They thought they were hicks. They thought they were country folk. And they were. They were an agrarian society there. It wasn't the big city. So Nathanael at first is skeptical. But as soon as he meets Jesus, he proclaims that you are you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel. You're the Messiah. Now, Nazareth has an interesting name. There are those that say Nazareth doesn't appear in the scriptures, but it does. In Isaiah chapter 11, the word describes in verses 1 and 2 that there shall come forth a rod from the stem of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of his roots. The Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and fear of the Lord. And the word Nazareth comes out of that same root word of the branch, which is netzer. So this is a prophetic statement about Jesus, the branch. And listen to the descriptor: the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and of the fear of the Lord. And then there's Bethsaida. Bethsaida was on the north shore of the Sea of Galilee, and it was a few miles from the town of Capernaum. And it means literally fishing house. That's kind of a interesting thing. We'd associate that with, a lake. That's normal. And the businesses that were there. And then there's Capernaum. And Capernaum is the village of Nahum, the prophet who was a contemporary with and went to the city of Nineveh and preached the gospel a second time after Jonah had been there. So Jesus fits into all of these scriptures. Bethlehem, we'll go back to the beginning. Bethlehem means the house of bread, and that's where Jesus was born, in the house of bread, in a manger. And he said, I am the bread of life. What do you use a manger for? Use it to feed animals. He says, I am the bread of life. Nazareth is the netzer, the branch. He is the branch out of the root of Jesse, which is prophetic. He's in the lineage of David, and he proclaims himself to be the true vine. Bethsaida is where he goes to the fishing house to make fishers of men. And later he makes his home in Capernaum, the village of a prophet. Each of these 5 men were exposed to Jesus and became his disciples. They had been educated and possessed knowledge of the Tanakh, or the Old Testament, the Jewish Bible, and had been waiting for the Messiah. Now he is in their midst, and soon he would call them to be his apostles, his sent out ones. So in a matter of a few days, Jesus is proclaimed as the Messiah by John the Baptist at the Jordan, followed by Andrew and John, and then Peter, and Philip is called directly by him, and Nathanael is introduced by his friend, and all would follow Jesus from this point in history until their death. Andrew was crucified on an X-shaped cross, and as he was approaching it, Fox's Books of Martyrs says that Andrew said, "Oh, blessed cross, how I have longed for thee." That's commitment, folks. John, tradition says, he died naturally, but he was boiled in oil and then exiled on the Isle of Patmos, which was just a big rock, little vegetation, nothing to survive on. Peter was crucified upside down. Philip was also crucified upside down, and Nathanael, also known as Bartholomew, was skinned alive. Altogether, these men, these 5 men, and the rest of the disciples, the rest of the apostles, would go to their death refusing to deny that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, the King of Kings. So that's something for us to think about as we wrap up the Gospel of John, chapter 1. Search the scriptures, check it out. Always search the scriptures. Make sure that what you're being taught is in line with them. And seek the Lord while he may be found, my friends. And as always, May God richly bless you, my beloved. Have a wonderful